Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. It's Easter time. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and joining me is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, happy Easter.
Hey, Brandon, same to you and to your family. Blessings this season.
Now, we're not only in the Easter season for you, I know we're also back into the confirmation season. This is your second go around as a bishop. Tell us a little bit about what this season means for you.
Well, it's wonderful. I like confirmations a lot, and I go all over my region. So I've got about 40 or so parishes in this region, and I do the confirmation pretty much at all of them, a couple of exceptions. So it's hyper busy because in LA we do them in a concentrated way in the 2 months after Easter. So a lot of dioceses will do confirmations year round. We do them all at once. And there's something good about that, in the Easter season, and you kind of just do it. But it makes for a pretty intense time. So the next about 5 weekends, I'll have typically a confirmation Friday night, then 2 on Saturday, 2 on Sunday. So it's a full day. But I like the confirmations, and it's a great way to reach out not just to the kids but to their families, many of whom have been away from church for a long time, and this is one of those moments when they reconnect. And so it's super important, I think, that your presence, the homily, just the way the liturgy unfolds might draw some people back.
Do you usually give the same homily at each confirmation? And if so, what are the main points that you try to hit on?
Well, what I've done now, this is as you say, the beginning of my second year. Last year, I developed a couple of homilies. One reason, to be honest with you, is you just get sick of your own homily, when you've given now for the 27th time. So I had developed one, but then by the end of the season, I developed a second one. Then for this season, I've developed a third. And bishops would talk and we'll say, hey, what are you doing this year for confirmation? I got a really good suggestion from Bishop Ed Clark, who's one of the auxiliaries here. And he said, I'm talking this year about Jose Sanchez del Rio, the newly canonized saint from Mexico, because a lot of our kids are from Mexico. And 14 years old, and died for the faith. And so, he can say to these kids, hey, someone exactly your age who was challenged in his faith and stood up even to the point of death. So I thought that's a good idea. And I might work him in or develop a new homily around him. So you're always working the angles,
Well, we're now into the Easter season. We just celebrated the great feast of Easter where we commemorate Jesus' rising from the dead. And that ties well into today's topic, which is the case for the resurrection. I want to use as the springboard for this discussion a movie that you recently saw called Case for Christ. First of all, tell us about that movie. What was it about?
Yeah, it's based on Lee Strobel's book of the same name, which goes back, Brandon, about 20 years or so, maybe, or longer. I must say I didn't read the book, even though I knew about it, but I went to see the movie with my friend Chris Kazor, who's a great a Catholic professor at LMU, and the two of us went to see it. And it's a story of this man in the 1970s, who was a intrepid reporter, for the Chicago Tribune, hard-hitting, analytical, skeptical, and in fact atheist. Career's taken off, everything's going great, but then his wife becomes a Christian, and it completely throws him for a loop. And he's flabbergasted, like, how could she possibly accept this crazy superstition? So he decides that he's going to use all his, repertorial skill to debunk Christianity. And so he sets out on this sort of mission to ask all the tough questions, not put up with any of this old bunk and debunk of Christianity. And then to make a long story short, in the course of his investigation, he himself becomes convinced of the truth of Christianity. So it's a cool story, I think it's a true story, about someone coming to faith from a very aggressively anti-Christian perspective. So that, makes for a lot of drama.
I remember I first came across that book, Case for Christ, about 10 years ago when I was in college, and I was maybe sort of a spiritual but not religious, loosely evangelical. And when I read that book, it changed my life because it was the first time I encountered somebody who was asking hard questions of smart people. And for me, it was the first exposure to the idea that Christianity could be rationally defensible. I thought, oh, Christianity is wonderful. It's emotionally compelling. It makes me feel good. It was the first time I thought, wow, smart people actually believe this. Talk about how even though he was aggressively skeptic, he didn't just sort of debunk the low-hanging fruit answers of, say, fundamentalist Christianity. I mean, he went after experts in each of these disciplines surrounding the resurrection, didn't he?
Yeah, and that first point's an important one, that it's the resurrection he looks into, because a colleague of his at the Tribune, who was a Christian, he approached and said, well, now, if I wanted to debunk this religion, how would I do it? And the guy said, well, I guess I'd start with the resurrection, because if there's no resurrection, the whole thing is a house of cards. And that's an exactly right instinct, it seems to me. And so off he went, asking the hard questions. So here's a couple observations I have. The first one is Christianity at its best, and I'm speaking out of the Catholic tradition, which is very explicit about this, but Christianity at its best does not eschew reason. It does not say check your brain at the door when you come to faith. It does not accept a fideism, right? The view that it's just a matter of faith and reason, you just have to forget about that. No, 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 no. If we say, for example, that Jesus is the Logos incarnate, right away, and this is a Pope Benedict point, right away, you're making a statement about reason. You're saying that Jesus is God's reason incarnate. Therefore, it's never a matter of putting down the mind, in fact, elevating it. So Lee Strobel, I would say, in the 1970s, asking his tough reporters questions, is a somewhat minor key version of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, asking his very high-level philosophical questions about the faith. As I've often said to my students over the years, when Aquinas says, utrum Deus sit, Latin for whether there's a God, I wonder whether God exists. Heck, if you can ask that question, you can ask any question. No one's telling you put your mind to sleep or, oh, no, don't ask that hard question. No, ask all the hard questions you want. So that's the first thing I really liked about it.
I especially appreciate that because I know when I talk with my atheist friends, they often assume that Christians are closed-minded, closed to reason. Yeah. They're not open to exploring the evidence. But in this case, in Lee Strobel's case and in the Aquinas case you just described, I mean, we Christians are open to following reason and evidence wherever it would lead. And we even explore how Christianity could be debunked. St. Paul says it himself. If the resurrection is false, if somehow you could show that that's historically or reasonably implausible, then the whole thing falls like a house of cards.
Yeah. So it's a rational religion, or reasonable religion. The second thing I want you to see is that Christianity is a deeply historical religion. It's based upon a very particular claim that this Jesus, who was a real figure in the first century, died and then rose from the dead. The resurrection is not a vague narrative that's undergirding some independent spiritual insight. No, that's the insight. That's the thing that matters, is that Jesus rose from the dead. And therefore, it invites historical analysis. It's fair to raise historical questions. If you could prove, indeed, that Jesus didn't rise from the dead on historical grounds, then Christianity would collapse. Good. So on both those points, it's reasonable, it's historical. Lee Strobel's questions are fair. And I think Christians actually can enter into his story with a certain sense of excitement, because we know that something is really at stake in this, So I had that sort of thrilling sensibility as I watched the movie and watched him raise the hard questions.
Well, maybe over the next 10 or 20 minutes here, let's raise some of those questions. Let's look into some of the issues that Lee Strobel himself explored. One of the first things he did was to look at some of the skeptical proposals regarding the resurrection. So what are some of the alternative hypotheses? Maybe the first one, which I would say is probably the most common one in our culture, is that the resurrection is kind of just a nice symbol or a nice myth. We believe in Jesus' resurrection kind of like we believe in the life and meaning of Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Lincoln. Their cause continues on in our minds and hearts. Talk about this, that the resurrection is just a symbolic event.
Yeah, or it's a pious story, that people invented, people of goodwill, because they wanted to express the fact that Jesus' great principles live, on in the community or whatever. And to be fair, when I was going through school back in the 70s and early 80s, there were a lot of serious Catholic theologians proposing things along those lines. You know what the problem is? Is that so many of the first Christian witnesses died defending the truth of the claim of the resurrection. So, I mean, I don't care how powerful you think your invented story is, you're not going to die for it. You know what I mean? If someone says, look, either you tell me that story is false or I'm going to kill you. I mean, no, look, it's false, man. It's a cool story that's meant to undergird certain spiritual principles. But no, don't kill me, because, I mean, the story's not true, literally. But see, they went almost to a person to their deaths defending this claim. There's, C.S. Lewis saw this. There's just a difference in texture when you look at the New Testament witness. I put it this way, that those texts crackle with an excitement that you don't find in mythic rhetoric. I love the myths. Don't get me wrong. I love them. They're great. And I get it. I get stories that undergird spiritual points. Watch The Beauty and the Beast. And from that, you might derive certain spiritual insights. Great. But see, if someone said, unless you deny the truth of the story that there's a beast living out in a magic castle, I'm going to kill you. Oh, no, there really isn't one. Don't kill me. It's a nice story I'm telling you to make a spiritual point. I'm not going to say, yes, I will die to defend the truth of the claim that there's a beast in a magic castle. But that's what they did in regard to Jesus and his resurrection. That gives you the difference in the texture. Like, just stay with that for a second, The Beauty and the Beast, because you watch that movie, you read that story. I mean, it's clear to everyone it's a fairy tale. And I love fairy tales. Most people like them, But then you read the New Testament. That's Lewis again, who said those who think the Christian story is a myth haven't read many myths, right? They don't know the texture of that literature. There's something different in the texture of these claims. Look at Paul's letters. Paul who says, look, I saw him. I saw Jesus. Paul who went to his death, endured prison, shipwreck, stoning, lashing, everything else, and went to his death defending it. You don't do that for a fairy tale. That's the point.
Besides the fact that the texts themselves, the New Testament accounts, bear none of the traits of ancient myth, as Lewis said, and he's a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature. He knew myths better than almost anybody. Besides that, as many people have pointed out, there's never been a case where a myth around a historical person arose during that person's own lifetime, during the generation after which he may have died. There just wasn't enough time. And so we have in the first century people who not only knew Jesus but claimed to have seen him after he died. Let's pivot to that point too. I know this was a big thing for Lee Strobel in his book. It's often proposed that perhaps the many people who saw Jesus after his death were merely hallucinating, that they thought they saw Jesus, but they really didn't. Talk about this proposal.
Part of that, Brandon, too, is born of our condescension toward ancient peoples. It always strikes me that somehow we think, these poor souls, before the age of science, who didn't know anything, so they were just misled. The very fact that the New Testament authors are very interested in giving us a whole list of different people that experienced the resurrection proves that they knew. Yeah, some guy might be just nuts, or someone just dreamed this up, or someone's having a wild hallucination. They were very interested in the fact that it wasn't just Mary Magdalene, it wasn't just Peter, it wasn't just John, but rather all of these people, first to him, then to her, then to him, then to the famous passage in the Acts of the Apostles, to 500 brethren at once. Or that's it's in Paul, right? Because I'm thinking when Paul says there, and some have fallen asleep, but others, he's implying, you could go ask them. Well, you don't talk that way if you're in a mythic framework. You don't talk that way if you're convinced this is just some kind of crazy person having a hallucination. Well, then what he pursues, of course, in the movie, which is, to me is the skeptic grasping at straws now, is it's a mass hallucination, all at once. And I like the fact that the psychiatrist, and it took me a while to recognize her, played by Faye Dunaway, the famous actress, plays the psychologist. And she is a skeptic herself, a non-believer, but she says to him, it just doesn't work that way. And in fact, if 500 people at once had the same dream or hallucination, that would be more miraculous than the resurrection. And that had a big impact on Strobel, that line, because I do think that's when the skeptics begin just getting desperate. So no, I think that the mass hallucination theory, or just that one or two crazy people dream this up, that's just not going to hold water.
And talk about too how in the Bible all of the post-resurrection appearances are bodily in nature. They emphasize that over and over.
It's very important, isn't it? Because these are Jews. This is coming up out of a Jewish framework. These are not Greeks. These are not Platonists or Gnostics. The game here is not escape of the soul from the body. It's the redemption of the body, And so it's very important to them, and they report it carefully, the bodiliness of Jesus. Because, see, for a Jew to say, oh, he died and his soul went to heaven, that wouldn't be resurrection the way they're describing it. And they knew enough of the Hellenizing kind of world to know that sort of framework, but that is not what they're testifying to. But they insist upon the bodiliness of Jesus. So, myth, or it's a symbol that his cause goes on. I mean, that's just not the game they are playing at all.
Let's go down another route that Lee Strobel goes down too. So he's starting to realize that, okay, the resurrection has some historical basis. It almost certainly could not have been a mass hallucination. His next route then is to say, well, then maybe Jesus really didn't die on the cross, and therefore he never resurrected because he was never dead. A lot of skeptics call this the swoon theory. They propose that Jesus somehow survived the crucifixion. Would that have been possible? Could he have survived this gruesome death?
Yeah, this is crazy. I don't know if this is before your time, but when I was a young guy in the 1970s, there was a book called The Passover Plot. And I would have been about, 14 or 15 when it came out. So, I read it. And it's the swoon theory. The Passover Plot says that Jesus was indeed crucified, but then they put this drugged, liquid up to his mouth, and that's what it caused him to go into a swoon. He was taken down in time by conspirators, put into the tomb, and then he revived in the tomb, and I guess came staggering out, Well, here's a couple observations. And Strobel checks this out with a physician from L.A. He flies out to Los Angeles. And physician says to him, yeah, I've heard the swoon theory, but it's rubbish. And then what he does is he goes through the process of a Roman crucifixion. What happened when the Romans put someone to death? And of course, we now know these horrific details, helped to some degree by the Shroud of Turin, which gives you a lot of physiological, anatomical detail. But he went through the process of, bleeding to death, asphyxiation, and then makes the common sense observation. The Romans were darn good at putting people to death. And if you're a Roman commander, you're a Roman legionary, and you fail in killing one of your victims, you yourself would be subject to capital punishment. I mean, so the view that the Romans would have allowed this fellow to not to be killed on the cross is beyond ludicrous. Also, the observation about the spear, blood and water, and the author of the Johannine Gospel says, I find it very moving that I saw this. I was there, and blood and water came out. Well, we recognize now the pericardial fluid around the heart coming out with the blood. Well, no one who's pierced in the heart with a spear survives, right? Now, go back to my earlier observation. What I always find, the reason I'm laughing so ludicrous about the swoon theory is, let's say it happened. So Jesus is brutally crucified. He's on the cross for several hours, but somehow miraculously he survives this awful ordeal. He's taken down from the cross, placed in the tomb. Well, then he comes, at best, on this reading, at best, he comes staggering out of the tomb, desperately wounded, and maybe comes falling at the door of the nearest disciple to say, I'm alive. Now, I put it to you, would you, witnessing this event, say, by God, he's the Son of God? and I'm going to start a whole new religion.
The Lord of life.
You'd say, get him to an emergency room. You say, get this poor man into intensive care as quickly as possible. You don't invent a new religion based on that kind of desperately inadequate resuscitation. You know what I'm saying? What they witnessed to was that Jesus, who died on a Roman cross, which means in the worst way possible, is alive again, and not just alive again in some ordinary way, but in this elevated, transfigured way. That's what got their attention, not someone staggering out of the emergency room. You know what I'm saying? That's why, to me, the swoon theory is just beyond ridiculous.
One thing that helped me after I read Strobel's book, I got a little deeper into the resurrection stuff, and I read N.T. Wright's work on the topic. I know you have as well.
Yeah.
His masterful, big 600 or 700 page book goes through all these theories, and the thing he keeps coming back to is that none of these theories explains the full scope of the evidence. You know, so we have things like his apparent death on the cross, the empty tomb, the disciples' reactions, all that. Each of these theories makes sense maybe of one or two of those things, but they don't account for all of them. The only proposal that does is the resurrection hypothesis. I want to look at one more line here that Strobel spent some time in his book and in the film looking at. And I don't know in the movie what the chronology is, but at some point he realizes, all right, none of these proposals are really going to work. And so the last resort is to question the reliability of the biblical accounts themselves, that maybe these accounts of Jesus dying and being raised from the dead were doctored over time. Maybe there was copyist errors. Maybe there was a big gap between the time they were written and there are earliest copies. Talk about the reliability of these accounts.
Yeah, that's one of the questions he has. And so he goes at someone's recommendation to a priest. And when I was from the movie, gathering he was a Catholic priest, I think, and also an archaeologist and a specialist in ancient manuscripts. And so what he does is this man tells Lee Strobel very patiently that the New Testament texts are among the very best attested texts in the ancient world, meaning that we have copies that go back very close to the original in huge numbers. So he compares it, for example, to copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. A text that goes way, way back before the New Testament was written. But who's questioning the validity of those texts? And we have far, far better textual evidence for the New Testament. Or, I remember when Bart Ehrman was going on about this stuff and, that we don't have the original text. Well, look, man, we don't have the original text of almost anything from the ancient world. So, I, as a young man, read all the Platonic dialogues in philosophy class. You know what the earliest manuscript we have of the Platonic dialogues, meaning something that a human being copied, is like, I think, from the 9th century. Well, heck, the Platonic dialogues go back many centuries before that. The point is, they were copied and passed on. And yes, the earliest we have, if you want, what's the earliest textual evidence? The 9th century. Who doubts them, though? Who's saying, I wonder how reliable these texts are? What happens now with the skeptics is they give you this impossibly high bar when it comes to religious texts. That unless I've got the signed autograph, from St. Peter, then I don't have anything worthwhile. Well, that's a standard that's infinitely beyond anything we expect from ancient texts. The New Testament is the best attested text in the ancient world.
Let's close here with a look at how all these pieces finally came together for Lee Strobel. You point out in your article on the Case for Christ that much in the vein of John Henry Newman's illative sense, there wasn't one logical or rational argument that won him over. Instead, it was sort of a collection of all these moving pieces that converted him. Talk about how that works in the process of conversion.
Yeah, I'm a Newman man, as you say, and Newman famously speculated on what he called the process of coming to assent in matters religious. So it's a fancy way of saying, what leads you to say, yeah, I believe, I accept that. And Newman's argument, which I think is very plausible, is that there's hardly ever like one clinching argument. So let me just sit down with you. Here's the argument. Yeah, I get it. I believe. Usually, Newman says, in life, and not just in religious matters, mind you, but in all kinds of matters, I take in this probable argument, this hunch, this intuition, this testimony, and he says, availing all of these separately, I notice how they converge on a common point. And that's what leads the mind typically to assent, to say yes. And see, very often if someone says, no, why do you believe that? It's hard to say, well, here's exactly why. Here's the argument. No, we tend to say, it was accumulation of a lot of things over a long period of time. But the key is all of them tending in one direction. So the Strobel case I thought was very interesting is, this and this and this and that, this expert, that expert, this hunch, this question. My wife, very interesting, my wife's witness as she's coming to faith, that all these things converge on the point that, yes, this Jesus, who claimed to be the Son of God, is risen from the dead. That's what led him, I'd say, finally to believe. And so it goes with all of us.
One element in the movie, and I haven't seen the movie, so you tell me if this is right, it seems like a lot of this was clinched with his encounter of the Shroud of Turin. Was that a sort of a converging moment for him?
Well, it's interesting because it happens relatively early when he's talking to the priest. The priest brings him out, and they're in a real technical discussion about texts and all this. But then he brings him out into the church, and there's this life-size reproduction of the Shroud of Turin, which Strobel, kind of knew about. So he's looking at it and the wounds and everything, and the priest isn't saying much. And then they show Strobel looking into the face of the Shroud of Turin image. And then he goes, what would have made him go through all this? And the priest goes, oh, that's easy. Love. And it's one of those moments where it wasn't like a super rational question. It wasn't a hard-hitting, skeptical. It was more this musing sort of, what? But what becomes clear to me anyway in the movie is as he's availing all these different arguments, that also occurs to him. It's the face of love revealed in Jesus, I think, pushed him over the edge or drew everything together. And see, that's the cool thing because, hey, I'm a rationalist. Great. I love rationalists. Great. Off you go. But for most people, it doesn't finally come down to reason. It comes down to something that goes beyond reason or ties it together. I think the face of Jesus and his own wife's faith had a lot to do with his assent.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. If you have a question, please send it to us. You can do that by visiting askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question there on any device. Today we hear from a young friend named Chris, who in many ways is following the same path as Lee Strobel. He's a skeptic who's interested in Christianity, but he's a little worried about what his friends might think about it. So here's Chris's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Chris, and I'm a 20-something from Massachusetts. After being away from the church for some time, I feel a desire to return to God and His church. One of my final hurdles I am facing is that no one closest to me shares or understands why I would go and worship a God that I can't even prove empirically is real. I'm afraid if I start publicly reigniting my faith, the ones closest to me will think I have changed and become worried. Do you have any advice for me or anyone else in a similar situation? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's good. And it is along the lines of the Lee Strobel movie, because what he faced, it's the other way around, as his wife is coming to faith. She felt the withering criticism from her husband, and it caused a serious problem in their marriage. Brandon, over the years, I've dealt pastorally with couples in this situation, and in some cases, it's like a non-issue. In some cases, I know a couple, the woman is hyper involved in the church, in evangelization. Her husband is atheist. But she has friends over and he entertains them. And for him, it's like a nice little hobby. It's a funny little hobby she's got. And he's harmless. But I know other couples, more like Lee Strobel, where it's a major, major problem. The other thing, the other analogy here is with seminarians I've dealt with, guys who are thinking about the priesthood, but they know their family is not supportive. And what do you do? Here's the bottom line. Bottom line is you got to do what you got to do, meaning you're not living your family's life. You're living your life. You're being summoned. You're being called. So at the end of the day, End of the day, the bottom line is you got to make this move, even if it means you're alienated from your family, even if. Now, having said that, that's bottom line. To do everything you possibly can so that it doesn't come to that point, And I think, the best thing is a honest and patient explanation. That when the question comes up, say, here as best I can are the reasons that have led me to this point. I think dissembling is not a good idea. I think pretending and hiding is not a good idea. I think a clear, non-defensive, friendly response. Here's why I believe. Now, I hope sincerely that they'll come at least to accept that and say, okay, I get it, and let you do it. But if push comes to shove and your family says, I'm against that, I don't get it, I'm not with you, okay. You got to do what the Lord's calling you to do, Just a last thing, you mentioned the empirical proof. Don't be suckered into the word empirical, because that's what people will do. And that's a type of scientism, right? Unless you can prove it empirically, it's not real. Come on. There's a million things that are true and important that aren't verifiable through the scientific method. And God's existence is one of those. Doesn't mean for one little second that there aren't clear rational warrants for belief in God. But don't get drawn into that. That's the way that they'll try to outmaneuver you at the very beginning. No, there aren't empirical experiments that show that God exists. But go on Brandon's website, go on Strange Notions, and you'll find 20 famous arguments for God's existence. If you want to, use one of those to explain to a skeptical family member, well, here's a reason why I think it makes sense to believe in God. Anyway, those are a couple simple thoughts around a really important and complex question.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. We hope you have a wonderful Easter here. We hope you celebrate more joyfully the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Quick request for you, if you could, please leave a review of the Word on Fire show on iTunes. It helps us out a lot, and it only takes you a few seconds. So just go to wordonfireshow.com, click on the review button, and leave us a good review on iTunes. Well, thanks so much, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.